Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Williamson. I'm professor of religious studies at Hendrix College and the founding pastor of Mercy Community Church in Little Rock. I'm also the co-host of the Bible Worm podcast and the author of this little book, The Forgotten Books of the Bible, Recovering the Five Scrolls for Today. This lecture is part of a series covering all the chapters in the book, and this in particular is the first part in a two-part lecture on the book of Esther. As always, you're free to use these videos for your class or for your book group or just for your own personal use, however you find them useful. So with that, the book of Esther is set in the post-exilic period in the in the Empire of Persia. It's an interesting book because this is one of the only books that we have encountered where the setting is actually not in the Holy Land, but is actually in Susa, the capital of the empire. So in that sense, the question, or at least the circumstance of the book is, in a sense, the opposite of the book of Ruth. So in the book of Ruth, the question was, how do we welcome foreigners to live among us? In the book of Esther, the question is, how do we live among foreigners? What does it mean to be Jewish in the diaspora, in the dispersion? When you are in the land of another people, when you are in an empire that may be indifferent to you. What are the dangers? What are the possibilities? That's what the book of Esther is thinking about. Now, in terms of the historicity of the book of Esther, we don't have any evidence from anywhere else that there was a Jewish queen of Persia or a queen named Esther. And so while there is a historical setting here, it's set in the reign of Xerxes. It is in the capital city of Susa. There is a historical background. The text itself seems to be kind of a short story or a work of sort of what we might call historical fiction. It's an act of imagination asking questions about what does it mean to be Jewish in this, in the context of the empire. With that said, the book of Esther actually begins with a different queen. It begins with a Persian queen named Vashti, and she occupies the first chapter of the story, and then she gives way to Esther, as we will see. So the story of Vashti begins as the story of the king Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is the king of the Persian Empire, and as you will see, he's a very kind of self-involved guy. He wants everybody to be impressed with him. He wants to show off his wealth and his riches. He wants everybody to have a good time, to say good things about him. He's very interested in his reputation, maybe more so than he's actually interested in governing an empire, at least in the biblical telling. So Ahasuerus has a party in the third year of his reign. He invites officials from all over the Persian Empire, from Ethiopia to India and all around the empire, Persia and Media, to show off, we see in verse 4, the awesome riches of his kingdom and the beautiful treasures. And why does he show them off? As mirrors of how very great he was. So he's showing off the treasures of the empire so people will be impressed with him. He has this party for 6 months, which is kind of amazing, and makes you kind of wonder if all the officials and all the the governors and the provincial officers are there, like who's been running the empire for the last year, But there you go. At the end of his 6-month party, Ahasuerus decides he's going to have another party. So now he has a 7-day party. This one is for all the people in the fortified part of the capital city of Susa. And so the first party was an empire-wide party. This party is for people who live in the capital, fortified part of the capital. This party lasts for 7 days, and it's divided in two. There's a men's party hosted by Ahasuerus. There's a women's party hosted by Vashti. And at the men's party, it says in verse 8, the rule about drinks was no limits. The kings had ordered everyone serving wine in the palace to offer as much as each guest wanted. So just kind of get that picture. It's an all-male party. It's going on for 7 days. People can drink as much as they want. That's what we're thinking about. At the same time, Queen Vashti has all the women at a feast in the palace. And we don't know really what they're up to. On the 7th day, when the wine had put the king in high spirits, that means he's pretty drunk, he gave an order to the eunuchs and told them in verse 11 that they were to bring Queen Vashti before him wearing the royal crown. She was gorgeous, and he wanted to show off her beauty both to the general public and to his important guests. Okay, there's a couple things in that description that are important. First of all, he's not interested in showing off Vashti because she is, a wonderful person or a great intellect or a powerful partner in rulership. He just wants to show her off because she's beautiful, and he wants her beauty to reflect on him. She's the crowning treasure in these treasures that he's been showing off, and he wants to show her off as a reflection, a mirror of his greatness. Now, when Ahasuerus invites Vashti, it says she's wearing the crown. The rabbis argued that she was wearing only the royal crown. That's not actually in the text, but it kind of gets at a point, right? This is an invitation of objectification. It is simply about her beauty, whether or not she is clothed in her royal splendor or clothed only in her royal crown. But in verse 12, Queen Vashti refused to come, as the king had ordered through the eunuchs. So Queen Vashti simply said no. And we don't know why. We don't know what motivated her, but we can imagine that she was just not interested in playing this game of being shown off as one of the king's treasures. She was not interested in being objectified in this way. So she says no. Now the king is furious. His anger, it says, boiled inside. Then he calls his courtiers together and he says, what should I do about this? And this you see here in 1:16 to 18 is the response of the courtiers, his royal advisors. And they say, this is so fascinating, Queen Vashti has done something wrong, not just to the king. She has also done wrong to all the officials and the peoples in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. So everybody in the empire has been wronged by this act. Why? This is the reason. News of what the queen did will reach all women, making them look down on their husbands. They will say, King Ahasuerus ordered servants to bring Queen Vashti before him, but she refused to come. This very day, the important women of Persia and Media who hear about the queen will tell the royal officials the same thing. There will be no end of put-downs and arguments. So this is the case that the officials make, is the king needs to punish Vashti because Vashti has set an example that women don't have to obey their husbands. Vashti said no, and so other women will say no. And how can we have that? Now, it's kind of an interesting observation that at least the officials think that women prior to this act of Vashti's, just it hadn't occurred to them that they could refuse their husbands. And so this one way of thinking about this is just, patriarchy at work, right? There is this implied power of men over women, that men control the discourse and women are to be obedient. And Vashti, in saying no, has troubled the patriarchy. And she's made it conscious in people's minds. Whereas it seems like before Vashti's refusal, people just assumed this was kind of the way it was. Now that Vashti says no, other women are going to say, oh, I could say no. And that brings this kind of artificial patriarchal construction into the forefront. And now people can challenge it. So they tell the king, and he does, send out a royal order and have it written into the law of Persia and Media, laws no one can ever change. It should say that Vashti will never again come before King Ahasuerus. It should also say that the king will give her royal place to someone better than she. So Vashti gets deposed. We don't know what happens to her. Maybe she is locked away in the tall tower. Maybe she is put to death. But she never again is able to come before the king, and she loses her place as the queen. Now, one question that people sometimes ask about this text is, did Vashti do the right thing? Right? She said no. She protected herself, her honor, her dignity, and she spoke up, in a sense, on behalf of all the women of the empire, but at great cost to herself. She lost the queenship, and she is put away, never to appear before the king again. And so was it worth it? And I think there's lots of ways to answer that question. My own answer is yes. Excuse me. That what Vashti did is a really important thing. And the reason that I say that is because Vashti has called the patriarchy to accountability Vashti has made present what was previously implied. And she has inspired, by using her position, by embarrassing the king publicly, she has inspired other women that they could also say no. Now, we don't get the stories of any other women who do that here explicitly told, but one imagines that there are women throughout the empire who do hear what Vashti did, and they do realize that they can stand up for themselves. So I think Vashti has, in some sacrificial way, self-sacrificial way, has opened up possibilities. She's opened a path for other women of the empire. So, with Vashti off the throne, the throne is now open for another queen. And as you know, if you've read Esther, Esther is going to become that queen. I like to think that Esther, who lived in Susa, was one of the women who was at the party where Vashti said no, or at least heard the rumor of Vashti saying no. And so that Esther is inspired by Vashti. There's nothing in the text that really supports that, but there's nothing in the text that really denies that possibility either. So I like to think that Esther carries on Vashti's legacy, but as we'll see, she does it in a very different way than Vashti did. The way the king goes about finding his new queen is kind of horrifying and fascinating. This is the way that it's explained in chapter 2. Let the king have a search made for beautiful young women who haven't yet been married, and let the king choose certain people in all the royal provinces to lead the search. Have them bring all the beautiful women together to the fortified part of Susa, to the women's house, to the care of Hegai, the king's unit in charge of the women, so that he might provide beauty treatments for them. Let the young woman who pleases you the most take Vashti's place as queen. Now, if you look at that, this is basically like a 5th century BCE version of like The Bachelor, except it's not, I mean, when I read this text when I was younger, before I really had studied it, I thought this is like an open call. If you want to be queen, like, apply here. But that's not what is said. What's said is he's going to appoint people to search out women and bring them to the king. So, I mean, one reading of this is it's kind of just a snatch and grab operation by the officials of King Ahasuerus. They just go out through the empire and they find beautiful women, they bring them to the king. And if you please the king, then you become the queen. But if you don't, you just end up in the house of discarded women, basically, in the sort of secondary concubinage house. So the stakes are really high, and King Ahasuerus seems to have learned nothing about respecting women. He's again looking, I think, to control the women of the empire. So Esther is one of the women who is brought into the king's palace for this contest. She is the cousin of a man named Mordecai. Mordecai had been like a father, it says, to Hadassah, that is Esther, though she was really his cousin because she had neither father or mother. So her parents had died, she was an orphan, her cousin Mordecai took her in. It's notable there that the word Hadassah, which means myrtle in Hebrew, is given as her name, but then she has a second name, Esther, which means star in Persian. And she's called Esther throughout the book. So it's this kind of interesting early clue to kind of the double identity of Esther. She is a Jew, but she's in the Persian Empire, and she's known by a Persian identity throughout the book. So Mordecai takes her in. Now, as the women are gathered in, Esther is taken into the palace, into the care of Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the women. And so the young woman, that is Esther, pleased him, that is Hegai, and won his kindness. So he takes a special liking to her, and he begins to give her special beauty treatments, give her special foods, and gives her servants, and moves her into the nicest room in the women's house. So Esther has pleased Hegai, and this is giving her a leg up in the competition. Now then we get this little aside in verse 10 and 11. Esther hadn't told anyone her race and family background because Mordecai had ordered her not to. Now that's an interesting little tidbit, right? Because Esther is Jewish, but Mordecai tells her not to tell anyone that she's Jewish. We're not told what his rationale is for that, but the only thing you can really think is that Mordecai has some suspicion that there is kind of beneath this placid surface of the empire, there is this kind of anti-Jewish or maybe anti-foreigner sentiment. And so Esther would be endangered if people knew she was Jewish, and so she's been told to keep it to herself. So Mordecai, while Esther is in this contest, paces back and forth. We're not sure if he's pacing back and forth hoping that she will win the prize or pacing back and forth hoping that she doesn't win the prize, but we know that he's nervous. Now Esther then goes into the king in the palace, and it says in verse 12, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won his love and favor more than all the others, and so he places the royal crown on her head and makes her the ruler in place of Vashti. So Esther, this charming, kind of obedient woman who hides her identity, becomes the new queen in the place of Vashti. So now the king holds a feast, called it the Feast of Esther, and he declares a public holiday for the provinces and gives out gifts. So finally, years later, the king gets his banquet with his queen, but the queen is not Vashti, the queen is Esther. Now we move briefly from the story of Esther to a secondary story, which, I mean, it's not really secondary, it's just a second story, which is going to intertwine with the story of Esther as we go. But it's the story of her cousin Mordecai and a fellow named Haman. The story begins in chapter 3. So King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, Hammedatha the Agagite's son, to being second in command in the empire. So this guy Haman, who is an Agagite, becomes kind of the number 2 of the Persian Empire, and effectively the ruler of the empire, because as we have seen and will continue to see, Ahasuerus really not that interested in actually making laws and such. Now we learned that he is an Agagite, and so Agagites are Amalekites. If you go all the way back to the story of Saul in 1 Samuel, you will see that in one of the reasons God rejects Saul as being king is because God sends Saul out to war against the Amalekites and orders Saul to kill them all, and Saul spares the king, and the king is Agag, who then is beheaded by the prophet Samuel. So there's a story here between this Agagite Haman, the descendant of this king who was murdered by an Israelite, and Mordecai the Jew. There's this kind of centuries-long tension between these two people groups, and now Haman suddenly is in a powerful position. Now verse 2 tells us that all the workers at the king's gate would kneel and bow to Haman because the king had ordered it, but Mordecai doesn't bow or kneel down. Now when I read this text before I was really studying it, I just kind of always thought that there was like mano y mano, right? That Mordecai comes in and there is Haman comes in and there's Mordecai and he says, I refuse to bow down. That's actually not what happens. It seems like there's a big group and Mordecai doesn't bow, but Haman doesn't really notice. But it's the other workers in verse 3 at the king's gate who say, why don't you obey the king's order? And then they keep asking him over and over again. And finally, they just tell Haman because they want to know what Haman's going to do. And then we get in the last little parenthetical there, because Mordecai had told him he was a Jew. So they've got it in for him in this interesting kind of way. When they find out he's a Jew and won't bow down, they go and tell Haman in order to see what will happen. Well, what happens is Haman goes berserk, and he decides, for whatever reason, he's not just going to kill Mordecai, but he's going to exterminate all the Jews of the Persian Empire. He escalates from this personal affront to this kind of magnified anger that is going to basically turn into a genocidal rage. So we see something here about leadership in this kind of empire where ethnic nationalism, anti-Jewish sentiment is bubbling there. Suddenly, when it finds its opportunity, it explodes kind of unexpectedly into a real crisis for the Jewish people. Now, King Ahasuerus then, Haman needs to convince Ahasuerus that he should allow this genocide. And so what he does is he takes dice, which are called pur in Hebrew, which is where the holiday Purim comes from, and he rolls the dice, and they try every day of every month, and they come up with the 12th month, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. So Haman goes to Ahasuerus, and pay attention to the way that he tells Ahasuerus that what he wants to do to the Jews. He says a certain group of people, he doesn't name them, exist among the other peoples. Their laws are different than those of everyone else, which is true, and they refuse to obey the king's law, which is actually not true. Jews were obedient to the laws of the Persian Empire. They just also had their own customs. This is kind of a law and order tactic that Haman has made to say there's this unnamed group of people, they're breaking laws, but I'm not really going to tell you which laws they're breaking. They're not like us, they're dangerous, so you shouldn't have to put up with them anymore. So in verse 9, if the king wishes, let a written order be sent out to destroy them, and I will hand over 10,000 kikars of silver to those in charge of the king's business. The silver can go into the king's treasuries. This sum of 10,000 kikars of silver is an enormous amount of money. I saw one scholar who calculated that it was 2/3 of the annual budget of the entire Persian Empire. So yeah, you can just imagine how much money. So the way that Haman makes his case is there's a group of people, they're dangerous to you and your rule, and I'll give you a lot of money. He's talking all of Ahasuerus' languages, right? Ahasuerus wants to be respected, he wants to be in control, and he wants to be rich. So this is the command that goes out. Fast runners were to take the order to all the provinces of the king. The order commanded people to wipe out, kill, and destroy all the Jews, both young and old, even women and little children. This was to happen on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. And they were also to seize their property. Now, before I really read this text, I keep saying that, but I thought the Persian army is going to go and commit this genocide. But that's not what the text says. The text says all the people of the Persian Empire are ordered to kill their Jewish neighbors, basically. They get an order from the king. It's really from Haman, but it's signed in the name of the king. And it says, you should kill your Jewish neighbor on this day, almost a year from now. Such a horrifying scene that is set in this text. If you imagine you're just like Joe Persian, right? And you're at home and you get this order that's like, you need to, a year from now, go and commit a genocide against the Jewish people. It's a horrifying command. And you wouldn't know what to do, right? Probably kill or face the wrath of the king. So the runners go, and you see in this last verse, Haman and the king, as the runners are headed out and there's shock all over the city, they sit down to have a drink, right? These guys are enjoying the chaos that they are instilling in the people. They are not good rulers of the empire. They are in it for themselves. Now then we come to chapter 4, which maybe is the most famous part of the book of Esther. What happens in this chapter is Mordecai, Esther's cousin, hears what Haman has done. And so he tears his clothes, he puts on mourning clothes, he puts ashes on his head, he goes into the city and he cries out. But he can't get all the way past the king's gate because the king has made a law that no one who is wearing mourning clothes, no one who is sad, is allowed inside the king's precinct. And so the king is so disinterested in being a ruler that he doesn't even let people who have grievances come and talk to him. And then in every province and place where the king's order arrived, a very great sadness came over the Jews. So you get this image of these kind of protests in the streets, Jews wearing sackcloth and ashes, crying out loudly in pain. They're making a huge kind of outcry in the empire. Now, Esther, in this really interesting way, doesn't know what's going on. So she sends her eunuch to go and ask Mordecai what he's doing. So Esther, who is in the king's precinct, in the palace, hasn't heard this order. But everyone throughout the empire has heard this order. And so this kind of vision of this insulated palace, the king doesn't want to talk about what's happening in the empire. So Mordecai tells the eunuch everything and gives a copy of the law to him to give to Esther. So the way Esther gets a copy of the law is from her eunuch through Mordecai, not directly from the king. And so Mordecai asks her to go to the king to ask him for help. Mordecai has created an uprising, an outcry, but he actually doesn't have access to the king. He can't do this thing on his own. So Esther says, everybody knows that there is a law that anyone who comes before the king without being called is to be put to death. Only the person to whom the king holds out the scepter may live. In my case, I haven't been called. So what she's saying is, if I go in there, he's going to kill me, and I don't want to go in there. And so Mordecai very famously says, "Don't think for 1 minute that unlike all the other Jews, you'll come out of this alive simply because you are in the palace. In fact, if you don't speak up at this very moment, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place, but you and your family will die. But who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be part of the royal family." So what Mordecai has done is he has appealed to Esther. You are a Jew. This is your family. And look how you have risen to a place of power in the empire. You have access to the king. And so maybe it is for this time, a time such as this, a moment like this one, that you became queen so you could save your people. This is what gets Esther engaged. Up until now, she was hiding the fact that she was a Jew. She is reluctant to go and talk to the king, but Esther appeals to her to save her people. He's done what he can do, which is to get the people to cry out, to get the attention of the queen. But he can't change the king's mind. Only Esther can do that. So we'll end there for this time. Next lecture, we'll look at the way that Esther goes about saving the people. It's such a fascinating way to watch her work. Her refusal to allow her people to be killed is in keeping with Vashti's refusal, but her tactics are very, very different. So we'll pick up there next time. If you're looking for me, you can find me at robertwilliamsonjr.com, on Facebook at robertwilliamsonjr.author, on Twitter at rwilliamsonjr. Go and listen to the Bible Worm podcast if you haven't already. If you want to get in touch, I'm Robert at robertwilliamsonjr.com. Thanks for being here. I'll see you again soon.